Hello, welcome to an exclusive Pixelflakes tutorial for RonanBeckerman.com. Today I'm going to be talking you through how we've taken this raw render here, all the way through to this final image you can see in front of you now. As per usual, this PSD will be available from the Pixelflakes Facebook page, so if you go over there, like the page, there's a little freebie section, and inside there's this PSD and some from previous tutorials that have been done on the site. So today I'm going to talk you through all of these folders, what each one does, the adjustments, all that kind of thing, and hopefully you'll be able to put something together of a similar nature and learn something from it. So let's get into it. So as I mentioned before, this here is the raw render. As you can see, it's a very simple scene, very simple lighting setup. I've got a HDRI texture in the environment slot, a direct light hitting these front faces here, and omnis within each of the rooms. Now, I tried to keep the 3D as simple as possible because I knew I wanted to do lots of work in Photoshop. So I think modelling maybe took about an hour and a half, the rendering took about 15 minutes, and then we've got it in Photoshop ready to start the real work. So this is the raw render on the right hand side on the stack here. I've then put some curves on top of that to give it a little bit of contrast and colour correction, and then I've put some render elements on top, so we've got the ambient occlusion and the reflection. So once this is in, I then started to work up the sky in the background. So the first step was to go online and find as much reference imagery as possible. So I found a load of different images here which I thought would help me to sort of embellish the scene. So whether it be just reference imagery or elements that can actually be used within the photoshopping process, I've gone online and found as many images as possible. So we've got some crates, some sort of tarmac, all this kind of thing, and finally the clouds. So this is going to be used for the sky. So I took this image, dropped it into the background, and then began to work on that. So the first step was to make it a little bit darker, and then add a bit of contrast. These are done through simple adjustment layers, so as you can see here. I then applied a colour dodge layer, which is a completely black layer with a white painted in the top right to give the illusion of light. And then I applied a photo filter just to match the sky into the building. I then masked off some of these elements that appear to be sort of sunlight creeping through. So because I knew I wanted to make this a night scene, I just masked out the top right hand side here just to give the illusion of it being night. So that was the layers that were applied to the background. The next step was to go on to a bit more detail within the building. So for the detail in the building, I rendered out a really quick region of some furniture that I've placed in the 3D scene. As you can see, it's just a few chairs dotted throughout each of the rooms. But as I drop this in, the colour is now different from the main render to the region. And that's due to the clipping masks that have been applied to the original render. So I applied these same clipping masks onto this region, which helps it to match the previous render. So now that we've got a bit of furniture and a little bit of detail within the render, I decided to go on to the base adjusts. Now the base adjusts is just a simple way of selecting smaller elements within the scene, such as the chairs or the top layer of a crate or the floor, and just apply simple adjustment layers to each of these aspects without affecting the scene as a whole. So if I go to the base adjust folder on the right hand side here, hopefully you'll get a better idea of what I mean. So for example, this first one here is a modifier which was applied to the windows to make them all seem a little bit brighter. So to do this, I went into the masks which were rendered out from the original render. I selected this yellowy colour here for all of the interior spaces, and then I applied this curves modifier to that selection. So as you can see, it's just affecting a smaller part of the building, not the image as a whole. So each of these are doing the same kind of thing. So this one here is affecting the colour of the crates. This one here is making the gap between these windows a little bit darker. I'll turn that on and off so you can see it changing. And each of these, as I work my way up, will just be affecting smaller parts of the scene. So this one here is quite a big one. You can see it really affecting the colour of these crates to make it seem a little bit more random. So again, simple selection, apply the adjustment, and then you've got the variation there. So that's the base adjusts. Quite an important part just to give a bit of a definition throughout the scene. So it's not affecting the whole image, just smaller parts of the building itself. So now that all the base adjusts have been applied, it's now time to go on to the main part of the Photoshop file, which is all the foreground elements. So all of the detail within the scene is held within this foreground group. So if I turn all of these on, you'll see here all of the elements within the scene turn on. So we've got the rain, all the road, the crates, all this kind of thing. So I'm going to go through each of these and I'll show you how they're put together. A lot of them have the same techniques applied. So basically I'll find the image online, it'll have to come through looking like this. I'll change the perspective so that it fits the scene. I'll then mask this off through various overlay types. So for example, this one here is hard light, and then I'll start to match it into the scene. So it's always important to make sure that you're matching these elements that you're dropping into the main building, so to this render here. So I applied an adjustment layer here, brightness and contrast, made it a clipping mask, and applied it to the building. I then added a little bit of atmospheric light in the top left, just to give the illusion that light is in fact creeping over the corner there. And this is the same kind of thing that we've done for each of these elements that have been dropped in. So this garage type building here on the left hand side, I'll show you the original image is like this. I then changed the overlay type and then added a few highlights onto it just to give the impression that it's picking up light on the corners. So this is the same kind of thing that was done throughout. So here we've got a little bit of detail that's been added to the front of the crates. So if I zoom in here and I'll show you how this was done. This is literally just a piece of text which has been applied to the front of the building. So if I turn that up, you can see it's just literally text. I then feathered out the corners using a rough brush, changed the overlay type to multiply, and then reduced the opacity. So this was done for each of these pieces of text as we work our way out the building. Now it's important to realise as well that as you drop in these elements, you have to make sure that the perspective is accurate. So as you can see here, each of these pieces of text is shifting as it goes up the building. I then applied some dirt to the scene. Now this was painted in, so if I show you the normal here, you can see it's just various colours which have been picked out from a palette that I created at the beginning. So from a reference imagery that I found, I picked a load of colours that I liked, which all sort of work well together, and then these colours have been used to paint in various pieces of detail like this. So at the moment this is just on a normal overlay type, but if I change this to overlay and then reduce the opacity, you can see that it's adding a nice bit of detail to the scene here. It gives you the illusion of dirt over these crates. So each aspect follows the same kind of rules. You drop it in, match the perspective, change it to match the building, and add a bit of detail. And that's basically how each of these pieces have come together. So it's important as well, whenever you're creating a scene like this, to give the building some sort of context to sort of ground the building. So to do that, I found quite a fitting image here, which is these crates. I've basically just masked these off to fit in the background, and then done the same kind of process again. So I've created some clipping masks here, made them darker, and then desaturated it, and again made it darker to fit into this building. So bear in mind these are in the background, they're probably going to be a little bit darker because there's not quite as much light getting to it. So you've got to keep these kind of factors in mind as you work your way through. So the next step was to add some detail to the metal. So bear in mind that I'm going to have some lights up here on the top of the building. So you would usually get some sort of differentiation between where the light is hitting the metal and the darker elements. So within this metal folder, I've applied a few different layers, again using that same palette I showed you before. I've painted in a variety of different colours here. So the first step was to create a colour dodge layer. As you can see, this sort of pulls out some of the green where this light will eventually be hitting the metal. And then I've applied a multiplier layer here, if I show you the original. To be honest, it's not much different, but it's just a sort of black which has been painted in, just to give the illusion that you've got this lighter and dark area of where the light source is going to be hitting the metal. So once that was done, the main aspect of this building is really the concrete and the road in the foreground. So I've found, again, some reference imagery online. So where are we? Here we go, the road. So if I show you the original image, so it's this piece of tarmac here, which was taken from one of the reference images that I found at the beginning. So again, by adjusting the overlay type, you get something immediately which sort of feels like it fits the scene quite nicely. So I dropped this in and again changed the perspective. So this was quite an easy one to match the perspective with, because we've got this joint line that runs across the concrete in the foreground. So by matching this to the same kind of perspective as the building, it almost fitted in quite well immediately. So I did a little bit of clone stamping just to take out all of the elements that I didn't want to be seen, and then started to adjust the sort of like colour correction. So again, we've got some adjustment types on top here. So the first step was to change the hue, so make it this sort of like bluey kind of tint, and then make it a little bit darker. So as you can see here, we've got this road now which sort of fits quite nicely. At the moment it's a little bit too bright, but as we start to paint in light and get a few more elements within the scene, we can start to match this in quite nicely. So the next step was to add the smaller details. So we've got here a little bike on the floor, which again was taken from one of the reference images I found at the beginning. And as well as that, I've put in a little bit of detail here from some different images. So I'll show you this one. This was the original image. I think it's some sort of like a Formula 1 racetrack, I think. And then I've literally just changed the opacity and the overlay type to get this. So you can see here, just by changing it from normal to overlay, it automatically sort of works quite well. And then again, the same kind of thing is done with this white line at the front. So adding these smaller pieces of detail, you can start to build up the image slowly. So as I've done before, this is a sort of, I wanted to give the illusion of a wet scene. So to do this, I've literally mirrored the building downwards. As you can see here, it's missing a little bit of detail because I did this previously before the foreground elements were added. But because it's simply a reflection, you don't need to make sure that everything's there. It can be kept quite loose. So I've flipped the building, flipped it down, and then I've blurred some of the elements within the scene to give the impression of it being water, and then I've masked it out. So as you can see here, it gives the illusion of there being a water and sort of like a reflection on the floor. This is just done through a normal overlay type, and then I've duplicated it, and this one is done through soft light. So this gives a little bit of a different finish. So already just from adding this road, you can see a lot of detail has gone into the scene, and it really sort of starts to help the image grow as a whole. So the next step was to add some of the lights. So as you can see here, through this group, we've added all of the lights at the top. So instead of messing around with high render times and adding sort of like IES web lighting or anything like that, you can simply do this just through images. So I went online and I found an image of a spotlight hitting a wall. I then masked this off, changed the overlay type to color dodge, and matched the perspective to the building and the scale of it. And then I just duplicated this around throughout the scene. So just by grabbing an image of a spotlight hitting a wall, you can sort of recreate this kind of illusion of lighting within Photoshop. And finally, I added just some white elements here within the light, just to give the illusion that it's on. And there you have the road and the lighting done quite quickly. Bear in mind, if you were to sort of do this in 3D and unwrap this road and sort of texture it or whatever, it would be quite time consuming. Whereas in Photoshop, you can literally just whack in an image that you found on the internet and just modify it to fit, and you've got a really nice looking road there. So at this point, we have the environment and the context looking quite nice. It's got quite a lot of detail, but the building itself is sort of lacking a little bit. There's no interior lights or detail in this left-hand section here. So in the next folder, I've masked out the interior sections, and I've applied a bit of detail to the scene. So it's all very simple. Sometimes when you're creating images like this in Photoshop, it's important to give the illusion of something being inside, but it's never really that important to really specify what it is. So for example, here I've dropped in an image on the left, which hasn't really got anything to do with the actual scene itself. It's just a random interior of a building. But by changing the overlay type and then sort of playing around with adjustment layers on top, and then doing the same kind of thing with various images, by overlaying all of this stuff, you can sort of give the illusion that something's inside, but it's not too specific what it is. If you were to search for very specific elements, you would you'd take ages online trying to find these images, and even then they may not fit properly. So it's quite important just to keep it as loose as possible. So that, for now, works quite well on the left-hand side, and then once you get all the other folders on, this works out to be a really nice sort of finish to this part of the interior. So once that was done, I simply masked off areas within the building, making sure that the perspective was again accurate, just to show this sort of like interior lighting. These are literally just selections like this, which are then filled with a colour. So that's all it is, just that kind of thing. So very, very simple. Again, instead of modelling something, it's just done through Photoshop. And then finally I apply a little bit of shadow within the buildings, and finally another colour dodge layer, which helps to bring out some of the lighting on the inside. So if I turn that layer on and off, you can see that there's a bit more detail now being added to the building itself. And finally I added some glass. So for the glass, I simply got a load of different images again firstly of the clouds in the sky. So I grabbed this same image which is on top here, applied it to the windows, and then reduced the opacity to give the illusion of there being very, very subtle reflections. And then again here, not really sure what the image is of. I think it's just a random street like this. This is a day scene, but because it's such a small reflection, it doesn't really matter too much. So if you then reduce the opacity, change the overlay type, it just gives very subtle reflections on the building. Again, if you were to sort of zoom in close and look at this building, you would sort of pick out these very minor details, but as a whole, it sort of helps to embellish the scene a little bit and give it a bit more realism. So all of these things were then added. I then applied a little bit of contrast and desaturated this glass panel at the top because there's no light behind it. And then you have a little bit more detail to the interior. If I turn both of these groups on and off, you can see here it makes quite a large difference to the image as a whole. So the next step was to add a person to the scene. Now, as I mentioned in my previous tutorial, it's always very important to add something in the scene which allows the viewer to differentiate the scale. So in this piece you could argue that the chairs show the rough size of this building, but without anything else in the scene it's almost it's quite difficult to show the exact size of this building. So I dropped in a girl here. So if I go right the way down to the original image, you can see here that I've cut out this girl from an image that I found on the internet and reduced the opacity just to make her blend with the scene a little bit more. And then on top of that I started to sort of marry her into the scene a little bit. So firstly, it's always good to start with shadows, so I've dropped in some shadows here, a load of different shadows because there's a load of different light sources behind her. And then finally just an ambient sort of area under her feet. If I turn this up you can see it's just a large shadow almost to act as just to ground her into the scene a little bit. And then finally I started just to paint on top of her. So firstly some soft light, which is a really nice way again just to pick colours from that palette and then start to paint in these elements on the girl. So sort of like giving her a bit of a green hue on this side, that kind of thing. The next step was to add some highlights. So bear in mind the light source is behind her. I added some highlights to her back and then some shadow to her front. So as you can see she's now starting to match into the scene quite well. I've then made her a little bit darker, desaturated her and added some final highlights. So by adding all of these things you can see here she goes from this all the way through to this here. If you zoom out as well, just make sure that she's matching in sort of with the colours and her brightness, her shadows, all this kind of thing to the original render and the image as a whole. So at this point she's working quite well, and it's now time to go on to the main sort of the piece, which is the rain. So if I turn the rain group on and off here, you can see that this it makes quite a large impact to the overall sort of mood and the feel of the image itself. So it's made up from a variety of different layers here. You've got the sort of main rain which covers the whole of the image. I mean, as it gets closer they get a bit less transparent, and they get bigger in size and a little bit more blurred. So you can see they're made up of almost from back to front. And then finally the hexagon type shapes which are almost giving the illusion that rain is landing on the lens of the camera. So to make these it was really easy. It was just a case of creating a brush which is sort of scattered like this. You'd probably want to make you know, a little bit more variation within the brush itself. And then you just go blur, motion blur, and then you sort of you just have to play around with this a little bit. It takes a little bit of tweaking to get the brush looking nice, but you can almost get this kind of these kind of streaks. And then if you mask this off and you start to paint out various things with an eraser, you can start to get the illusion of a little bit of variation. So it's literally done just through that. It will take a little bit of time to tweak the brush to look nice, but that's basically the process behind it. And then as the raindrops get close to the camera, they'll get bigger in size, and the opacity would go up, and then you eventually can sort of create this kind of this sort of rain elements. The same thing was done for these top ones. It was literally a case of creating sort of like a hexagon brush, blurring it in the same way, and then giving the illusion that one side of this brush, this dot is sort of blurred, and the other one's a little bit sharper. And that's how the rain was made. It was really easy, and it sort of adds quite well to the overall atmospheric feel of the image itself. So if I show you what this foreground group is doing again, I'll turn them all on and off. You can see that I've gone from this beforehand, so a really empty scene, literally no detail at all, to having this at the end. So you've got all your background elements, your foreground elements, your road, someone to indicate the scale of the building, and all your lighting. So as you can see, it's quite quick just to do it through Photoshop. I reckon to add all these elements probably took me about 5 hours, whereas as you can imagine sort of like modelling, texturing, all this kind of stuff would take a little bit longer. So that's all the foreground elements, and the next step was to go on to the lighting. So the lighting folder is the main part of the PSD, which adds sort of atmosphere to the image. So if I turn this on, you can see here it really sort of brings out some of this sort of the sort of air and smoke and all this kind of thing that almost gives sort of like a foggy kind of finish to the image itself. So we turn it on and off. So the first step is to create that atmosphere, which is done through a completely normal layer with a normal white brush, and then you're basically painting highlights onto this image. So here you can see I've got this quite focused sort of blotches here where the main light sources are coming from. I want this to almost seem like quite a foggy image, so I've put in quite a lot of light around the main light sources. Now bear in mind that the further something is away from the camera, the more desaturated and lighter it generally is. At night this isn't always the case, so I've had to play around with this a little bit, but this layer here is basically adding atmosphere between the camera and the buildings. So the next step is to create a multiply layer and start painting in shadows. This one's quite self-explanatory, it's just a way of painting in darker elements where the light isn't going to be hitting. The next step is the colour dodge layer. Now this one is, as I mentioned before, a completely black layer. Change to colour dodge, and then you want to paint white on top of that. If I change this to a normal overlay type, you can see here that I've literally painted in white where the main light sources are. So this is the window on the left hand side. You can see I've painted in here a nice big white splodge to show that there's light inside, and then as you sort of as it hits the road in front, you can see here I've painted in a load of sort of just splotches, sort of green highlights. It doesn't necessarily have to be white, it can be any colour, but it really sort of helps to accentuate the highlights within a scene. So if I turn this on and off, you can see here it's making quite a big difference. I then did the same again, just on a smaller scale above it, and then finally I painted in some light on a soft light overlay type. So this one, I'll change it to normal again, is just a way of painting in various colour. So here you can see I've picked out some sort of blues and greens from that palette I showed you earlier, and then by changing this to a soft light, there it is, you can just see that it sort of gives a very subtle colour throughout the scene. So down in the foreground there's quite a lot of blue, there's some blue and green in the top left there, and you can see this sort of adds just a little bit of colour to the scene, and it also allows you to paint shadows in. So that's the main light folder. If I turn that on and off, you can see it makes a huge difference to the scene as a whole. And then now in the adjust we'll go into the colour correction and final tweaks. So this final adjustment group at the top here basically holds all of the colour correction and smaller tweaks to the overall image. So if I turn this folder on, you can see this final group basically defines the mood of the image itself. So I'll shoot down again and I'll show you what each one's doing. So the first one here is just some really minor tweak to the image. I just sort of made this element here just a little bit darker, and then I sort of started to work my way up here. So we've got the vignette, which is the one of the first major things to be added to the image. So it basically darkens the outside of the image, which naturally draws the viewer's eye to the building itself. And now I start on the colour correction. So quite a good way of doing that is to create a hue and saturation layer here, change it to colorize, and then put it onto soft light. And this will basically colour correct everything within the scene. So it's always important to have all the objects within the scene in the same kind of colour range. So for example, this time I've sort of made it into this sort of green kind of finish. So even though you've got these containers at the back here, they sort of appear to be red. When you actually click on them, you know, they're quite a grey kind of colour. You've got this green here. You know, it's quite important to make sure that everything is kept in the same kind of colour range. So the next step again is more colour correction, which is done through selective colour. If you download the PSD from a website, you'll be able to see how all of this is put together. But as you flick through each of these, you can see I've just pushed colours in various directions to get this kind of finish. The next step is to add more colour correction. So we've got 3 different colour correction things going on here. This one is the curves, which is just making a little bit of contrast. And finally, I've put a hue and saturation modifier on top here, which basically completely desaturates the image and sort of picks out various spots within the scene which are going to have more colour coming through. So if I turn this mask off, you'll see that it's really quite a desaturated scene, but the mask sort of pushes through little parts of the scene to give them a little bit more colour. So again, the best way to sort of get your head around this is to probably just download the PSD from a Facebook page. Here we have some shadows. Again, it's some minor tweaks now, just sort of getting the image looking as you want it. And then some highlights. Now these highlights are quite important because this sort of makes the image pop a little bit more. So here you can see I've added another colour dodge layer at the top and painted in the white in the rooms and on some of the lighting aspects here. I've then applied a clipping mask to this colour dodge, and it works in the same way. If you paint white on top, it will come out the same kind of thing. I've just literally added some little flares to the building itself here. I'm going to reduce the opacity a little bit. And then finally I've just added a few little really minor tweaks. This just brings out a little bit of this corner. And then finally a sharpen layer on top. So if I zoom in, you'll be able to see what the sharpen layer is doing. If I turn this on and off, you'll see the image goes from being quite blurred to then being quite a lot sharper. So this is done simply through creating a copy of a whole image, then going into Filter, Other, High Pass, setting that to around 2 pixels and changing that to a hard light overlay type. And that will help you to sharpen the whole image. So at this point now it's important to specify where you want to crop it. So if you hit F twice, you'll go into this completely black border. So at the moment there's a bit too much floor and there's a bit too much going on the left hand side here. So by applying a load of layers which are literally just black outlines, once you then hit F twice, you'll see that this crop layer is basically bringing it in a little bit. So if I turn this on and off here, you'll get a better idea of where you want to crop the image. So that's always quite a useful way of doing things. So that pretty much sums up how this image was made. I'll show you again the original raw render, just to show you where this image has come from. So we've come from all the way from this, very simple scene, simple lighting setup, all the way through to this final image, just through Photoshop. So lighting, everything done through Photoshop. So hopefully this shows a lot of people what could be achieved. Again, the PSD is available from the Pixelflakes Facebook page, so go over and download it. Big thanks to Ronan for letting us host this on his website, and hopefully you guys have learned something from it. So thanks again, and we'll have another tutorial coming out soon. Cheers.